science. They might be trying to here comes science.
Hello everybody, and welcome to a very special and very important episode of Science. Today I'm going to be talking about a massive controversy that has been going on for more than 16 years at this point. It's sort of a follow-up to my video on stimulus-triggered acquisition of pluripotency, or STAP. In that case, there was scientific misconduct that occurred, and it's actually fairly well been wrapped up even in the months since I made the video. This, however, as I said, has been going on for more than 16 years, and it started off with a publication in the journal The Lancet. If you're familiar with the field and if you know The Lancet, then you might know the paper that I'm talking about is Andrew Wakefield's paper regarding the link between the MMR vaccine and autism in children. This is an enormous area, and vaccines by themselves are already fairly controversial. So I'm going to focus on this particular link. I'm not going to be going into other aspects of vaccines, and I'm not going to go into a lot of the other aspects of autism and its causes and things of that nature. However, what I will be doing is going over a very focused line of evidence that does and does not show that this link exists. Before I really get started, I have a couple of very important disclaimers though. First, if you have seen some of my videos before, then you know that I am a scientist. I work in molecular biology, I work with stem cells, I do a lot of work on a bunch of different things in that field. That said, I am not an immunologist. I do not work with vaccines or anything of the nature that I'll be talking about in this video. That said, what I have done is I've gone through and I've looked at all of the scientific peer-reviewed evidence on both sides of the case, and I've read it myself, so I know what they each say, I know what makes sense, I know what doesn't. Alright? But again, I myself personally am not in the field. Second, as I've mentioned a couple times already, I will be going over evidence on both sides of the coin, so to speak. I'm going to be talking about peer-reviewed published evidence that supports the link between autism and vaccines, and I'm also going to be going over peer-reviewed published evidence that does not support the link between vaccines and autism. I'll be going over both of them one at a time in separate sections. Last but certainly not least, as far as my disclaimers are concerned, is that the current research is very, very much against the idea that vaccinations cause autism, and I personally believe that. I am obviously very biased in that sense. However, I did my best to be as fair as I possibly could. As I said, I'm going over both sides of the argument. So with that, I'll just go over very briefly the individual sections of this video that I'll be going through. First off, once again, I'll be talking specifically about the MMR, mumps, measles, rubella vaccine and its link to autism. First, I'll be talking about autism itself. What is it? How does it work? What do we already know? And more importantly, how is it different from autism spectrum disorder, or ASD? Next, I'm going to be talking about vaccinations, what they are, how they work, what they contain, and some of the other controversies involved with them. I will then be talking a little bit about the science behind some of these published works. Specifically, I'll be talking about things like data analysis and grouping animals into the control and the experimental groups, how you work with the animals, how you work with children, whatever the case may be. The next thing is I'm going to be going into the arguments. Now, as I mentioned before, I personally do not believe that vaccines cause autism. So what I'm going to be doing is first, I'll be going over the peer-reviewed published evidence that says that vaccines do cause autism, and I will be saying why those are incorrect, bad science, and or just poorly done research. The next thing I'll be doing is going over some of the large-scale analyses regarding the idea that there is not a link between vaccinations and autism. As I said, there is currently a massive preponderance of evidence that this is the case, that there is no link. And as such, I had to go with some large-scale meta-analyses that looked at a whole bunch of other studies, right? And I'll be going over those very briefly as well. The next thing I'll be talking about is sort of the long-term implications to not only the world as a whole, but to children nowadays, as well as autism, because we do know that the autism epidemiology is going up, the prevalence is increasing, and also Andrew Wakefield's legacy and what he essentially single-handedly caused for the entire world. So that'll be sort of the end portion of not only what's going on right now, but also looking a little bit to the future. Finally, I'll be going over just some very brief conclusions, again talking about some of my personal beliefs about what's going on, how it's going to be affecting the world, and just a relatively brief summary of everything that I discussed. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started right away. We've got a long way to go, so buckle up because it's going to be a very interesting ride. Starting off, I'm going to be talking about autism itself as a disease. What is it? What causes it? What do we already know about it? The term autism was first coined in 1910 by a doctor named Eugene Buehler in order to describe some of the symptoms of schizophrenia. In this case, he was actually focusing on the idea that sometimes schizophrenic people will sort of be in their own world and heavily focused on one thing or another and not really being distracted by anything that's happening outside, be it people trying to talk to them or anything else. After that, in 1943, Leo Kenner first used the term in its modern sense to describe a separate disease called autism. Now, unfortunately, that obviously led to a little bit of confusion since it had previously been used to describe schizophrenia, but I'm not really going to get into that. Rather, I'm going to talk more about what we do know and how it works and how we know it functions. First and foremost, autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder. This means that essentially the brain does not develop properly in a child. Now, this happens very, very early on in childhood as the brain is forming, and specifically there are several parts that are known to form improperly in the growing brain, including the cerebral cortex, amygdala, and hippocampus. It seems that with autistic children, there is actually an initial overgrowth of the brain. That is, it's too big, or it's supposedly too big, and then it's followed by a relatively normal or perhaps slightly lower growth rate after a few years. For autism, for an actual autism diagnosis, there are 3 key symptoms that a child has to show. First is an impairment with social interaction. That is, they have difficulty interacting with people, be it in terms of there's a lot of lack of eye contact, they don't enjoy touching, things of that nature. The other thing, or one of the other things, is communication impairment. Just not being able to communicate how they feel, what they want, those kinds of things. They either don't know how to do it or they just simply cannot do it. Third and finally is a rather broad category that simply says you have a restricted interest and or repetitive behaviors. This can range anywhere from you are extremely focused and know a great deal about shapes, you know a lot about colors, you focus on a single color, or for example, for repetitive behaviors, you might stack things up, you might line things up, you might put things in a very specific order, something that might almost be akin to OCD. But regardless, if a child has all 3 of those characteristics, and a very vital piece is that they have to be under 3 years of age, if they have all 4 of those key requirements, then there might be an autism diagnosis. So what do we know about it, besides knowing at least a definition of what autism is? What causes it? We do know several things that are known to cause autism. First and foremost is genetic aberrations, genetic mutations, actual changes in the genetic code. We see this is a very well-established cause for autism. There are several genes that have been implicated, and in addition, if you look at identical twins, there's approximately a 93 to 98% correlation between one twin having autism and the other twin also being autistic. So that shows that there is definitely a genetic component. After that, there are what's called epigenetic modifications or epigenetic components. These are when you do not have a direct change in the gene sequence, but rather you have a change to how the genes are expressed. You have modifications to the actual DNA. Right? You don't change what the DNA is, but you change how it works. So this can affect expression of different genes, proteins, and things like that. Not as much evidence for that, however. There are a good number of prenatal risk factors that can increase the likelihood that a child will be born with autism. First and foremost is viral infection during late pregnancy. This is actually the second most commonly attributed cause, and it is the most common non-genetic cause because genetics are the highest one. This is also shown for other neurodevelopmental disorders, including schizophrenia as well. So as part of this, the immune system has been implicated as playing a role, and that's why some people think this virus, this viral-mediated neurodevelopmental problem occurs. It's been shown that autistic children have sort of incorrect immune responses to certain things, or they have a much more active immune system. However, the immunity aspect specifically has not been implicated. It has not. It's been noticed, it's been seen that that is an effect of autism. It is something that is seen in autistic children, but it has not been established as a cause. So one of the things that has been shown to have an effect, though, is drug use by the mother, as well as advanced age of either parent or both. And the autism is also rarely linked, or very little or no evidence to different chemical agents, including a very famous anti-morning sickness medication called thalidomide that ended up causing a great number of different birth defects. So overall, what are we saying? There are a lot of possible contributors to autism and a lot of possible causes of autism, but only relatively few have a very definitive effect that is supported by peer-reviewed and published research. The last thing I wanted to talk about with autism specifically is the difference between autism and what is known as autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. ASD is essentially like a catch-all term for several different disorders. First and foremost is autism. The actual disease autism is considered part of ASD. Obviously, it is the A. Second is Asperger syndrome, or Asperger syndrome, however you want to pronounce it. This is actually very similar to autism, but it's a very mild form of autism. The patients don't show any language delay, nor do they show any cognitive issues. There is still social impairment, however. Last but certainly not least, in the ASD spectrum, the autism spectrum disorders, is what's called PDDNOS, or pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. Obviously, this is an extremely broad categorization of a whole lot of different potential issues. This is what is frequently called atypical autism because it has a late onset, and the people who have PDD-NOS do not have all three of those characteristic symptoms of autism. They have one or maybe two instead. And again, late onset after 3 years old. So for the purposes of epidemiology, that is to say the spread of autism and the prevalence, the difference between autism and autism spectrum disorder is a very important distinction to make. And I'm going to be talking about that later on in my video here. But for now, that's it for my brief introduction about autism itself as a disorder and what we already know about it. So I'm going to move right into vaccines, what they are, what they do, how they work, and what is in them. First and foremost, talking about vaccines, the one note is that you can essentially describe a vaccine as a primer for your immune system. It's something that prepares your body for a potential infection. It prepares it for what's called an insult. And this is what's also known as a prophylactic. It's a preventative measure as opposed to something like a therapeutic vaccine, which is given after an infection. Therapeutic vaccines do exist, and they're even in use for some things like cancer, or potentially in use for cancer, but by and large, most vaccinations are prophylactic in nature. They are preventative, right? So they can the first major use for a vaccine in its what can be called a modern form was actually by Edward Jenner back in 1796. And what he did is he actually infected his gardener's 8-year-old boy with cowpox. Why did he do that? Because cowpox is very similar to another epidemic at the time, smallpox. Smallpox is an extremely deadly disease that is not only highly contagious, but also has a very, very high mortality rate. Cowpox, on the other hand, has very similar symptoms to smallpox, but very, very few people die. It has a very low mortality rate. So what Jenner was attempting to do is he thought that maybe if somebody had been infected with cowpox, then they were insulted with a smallpox virus, or just the smallpox, then they would be able to resist the smallpox because of the similarity in the two diseases. And thankfully it worked, because what he did is a few weeks after giving this young child cowpox, he infected the child with smallpox. Thankfully, his vaccination worked, and the child did not get smallpox at all. Not even any symptoms, much less dying from it. So when Jenner wrote this up, he actually called cowpox variole vacciniae. And from vacciniae, we get the word vaccine that we still use today to indicate any sort of prophylactic or therapeutic measure that involves either attenuated, inactivated, or otherwise somehow modified organism or part of an organism to prevent or stop an infection. That said, the smallpox vaccine is what we call an attenuated vaccine. And there are actually several major categories of vaccines, the first of which is the attenuated one, which is a live organism that is either not harmful at all or very minimally harmful. This is either done by disabling genes that cause virulence or by using a related organism. In the case of smallpox, obviously it was related. So some examples of this are the yellow fever vaccine, as well as MMR, typhoid, and then of course the smallpox. Next up is inactivated. Inactivated vaccines essentially contain dead, previously virulent organisms. So these are organisms that are infectious and are dangerous, but are dead. They're dead. They're not around anymore. They are not harmful, but they still have all of the stuff that your body needs to respond to them. Some examples of this are flu, cholera, bubonic plague, polio, hepatitis A, and rabies. All of those use inactivated vaccines. That said, there's an analogy that I want to use for attenuated versus inactivated. Now, using a pop culture reference to The Walking Dead. If you think about an attenuated vaccine, you can think of it as taking a walker and removing its arms and teeth. You still have something that looks like a walker, smells like a walker, acts like a walker, but it won't injure you. It can't harm you because you took away all of its capability to do so. An inactivated vaccine is similar to a walker that is once again dead, or permanently dead, as they say. Now, you can still take that walker, and as they did in the graphic novel and in the TV show, you can take its innards and you can spread it on you so that you essentially smell like a walker, and then you're free to walk amongst them. That is essentially how these vaccines work. It's the same principle. That said, moving on, there are a couple of other major categories. First is what's called a toxoid vaccine. This is specifically an inactivated disease-causing toxic compound. This is not a full organism. A couple examples of this are first tetanus, which is an inactivated form of tetanospasmin, which is a toxin created by Clostridium tetani, and obviously this causes the disease tetanus, which starts off with famously lockjaw, and essentially all of your muscles spasm and you can't move. It's a very, very horrible disease. It's very unpleasant. Another major toxoid vaccine is actually the diphtheria toxin. This is actually for the diphtheria toxin, that's actually what it's called, from Corybacterium diphtheriae. That is the organism that generates this particular toxin. And the toxoid vaccine inactivates that particular toxin. Once the toxin itself is inactivated, the organism itself is not harmful on its own. It's just the toxin that's harmful. Next up is the subunit style of vaccine. This is where you have a specific protein, often something like a surface marker on a cell on one of these organisms, and it will elicit an appropriate response from your immune system and give you a prophylactic effect. So things like hepatitis B, HPV, the Gardasil vaccine, and some flu vaccine use this. So for the flu vaccines, these are ones that specifically have the HN proteins. The hemagglutinin and neuraminidase proteins are in these vaccines, and that'll stop whatever the flu is. You don't need the entire organism. Next up is some of the minor styles of vaccine, or the minor categories. You've got conjugate, valence, heterotriptic, and then you have experimental. The experimental ones run the gamut from everything from dendritic cells, those are specific immune cells that can elicit an additional effect, recombinant vectors, DNA, because sometimes you can elicit a response just from DNA, T-cell receptor peptides, I mean, just all sorts of crazy stuff. But long story short, I'm not going to be talking too much about them. Just know that there are a lot of other types. So, moving right along, more with vaccines, in addition to the active vaccine components, they also have additional ingredients that have different functions alongside the vaccine itself, the active components. I'm not going to go over all of them, but I will be going over one that is very, very hotly contested, which is thimerosal. Thimerosal is a compound that contains mercury. It's essentially a form of ethyl mercury, or what's called ethyl mercury. This is used in vaccines as a preservative. It kills bacteria and fungi that could contaminate it. Importantly, I will say that it actually has a half-life of only 7 to 10 days. In other words, it leaves your body very quickly. It's very quickly metabolized. And depending on what recommendations you look at, what entity you look at, the safe levels for ethyl mercury, and keep in mind, this is with upwards of a 10-fold safety margin. That is to say, this is only about 1/10 of what it would take to actually hurt you. They range anywhere from 0.7 micrograms per kilogram from the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to 3.3 micrograms per kilogram from the WHO, the World Health Organization, and that's per week. So this works out to approximately 34 micrograms to 159 micrograms, using those same two extremes, the EPA and the WHO, during the first 14 weeks of an infant's life. And this is where they get most of their vaccines. Now keep in mind, those values are approximately 1/10 of what might start to be harmful to a human, right? Just keep that in mind. That said, the numbers are fairly scary. A typical scheme of vaccinations will give an infant 187.5 micrograms of ethyl mercury over the course of 14 weeks. It starts with 12.5 at birth, 62.5 at 6 weeks, 50 at 10 weeks, and then another 62.5 at 14 weeks. That does sound like a lot, and those do go over the individual weekly limits, but spread out, it's not nearly as bad. And again, 1/10. So, at the time, there wasn't any evidence, nor is there now any evidence, that supports the idea that thimerosal is actually harmful in its use in vaccines for its purpose of being a preservative. However, it was still removed from all childhood vaccines in 2001. It is still in the flu vaccine, though, right? It is still in there. But all childhood vaccines no longer have it. And in addition, the hotly debated MMR vaccine has been thimerosal free since 1983. 15 years before the autism controversy began, and therefore no place in the controversy whatsoever. Now, with all that said, it is important to note that just like pretty much any pharmaceutical that you run into, vaccines can and do have side effects, some being more serious than others, obviously. However, there are a couple of things that I wanted to note about this. First off, these can actually be indicative of additional issues with a child. For example, if you have an immune system problem, then you might be injured by a vaccine. Some kids end up getting the disease they're being vaccinated for, especially with the live version, the attenuated attenuated version. You might have a random mutation that makes it virulent again or something like that. Or, like I said, if the child already has an immune system problem, they might not be able to react correctly to the vaccine to gain the prophylactic effect. In addition, the adverse effects themselves are still extremely rare, just like many, many, many pharmaceutical side effects. Just keep in mind that even with penicillin and things like that, people are allergic to penicillin, so they can't take it. And it's the same thing with vaccines. By and large, vaccines are very safe and they work very well. So, that said, I'm going to move right along into a very brief summary about the science and the analyses that I'll be discussing. How the science was done, what the numbers mean, and all of that kind of stuff. In talking about how this science is performed, and arguably more importantly, what it actually means, I'm going to be talking about several very, very important issues. First and most importantly is the difference between correlation and causation. This is something that many, many, many people do not understand. And it's not surprising because they are similar and one can precede the other. So, this is extremely important, particularly for the case of autism and vaccines, because keep in mind, correlation is when events happen at a similar time but are completely unrelated to one another, whereas causation is where event A directly leads to event B occurring. The problem in the case of vaccines and autism is that autism is diagnosed around the same time that the vaccines are given. So the correlation between the two is very clear. However, the causation is not. And very, very importantly, in order to have a causal relationship, event B has to follow event A. I mention that now because it's going to be very important later on when I start talking about some of the publications. Next up in the brief about science is statistical analysis. Don't worry, I'm not going to get into statistics. I do not like them either. However, significance in science, saying that something is significant, means something very important. It indicates whether or not there is an actual true difference between two or multiple groups or however many groups you have versus a difference that can be explained by chance. This is where we get what's called a p-value. This p-value simply indicates the likelihood that something occurred because of chance. That's all it is. Typically, in order to say something is significant, in order to say that there is a significant difference, there has to be a less than 5% chance that this particular difference occurred by chance. Less than 5%, also known as a p-value of less than or equal to 0.005. All right, that's all I'm going to say about the statistics aspect. Next up, another very important aspect to performing science and doing science and reading about science is controls versus experimentals. A control group of animals, cells, whatever it is, will receive the exact same treatment as an experimental group, except for a single change. For example, if you're giving injections, say, of the MMR vaccine, then the experimental group will receive the injection that has the vaccine in it, while the control group will still receive a vaccine, but it will have something like saline, because saline doesn't do anything. It's essentially salt water. It doesn't do anything to our bodies. That way, you can actually see if there's a difference in the administration of the drug or anything else that's going on. And then you treat your control and your experimental groups exactly the same. If you're going to put them in an incubator, you put them both in the same incubator. If you're going to put them in housing, if you're working with monkeys, for example, you put them in cages that have the same sort of environmental effects, all of that kind of stuff. You change one thing and one thing alone, and that's it. That way, not only can you see if the procedures performed have any effect, but you can also get a more solidified base against which your experiments are compared, because then you can say more about it if the only thing that was different was one single thing. That said, the last thing about the science I wanted to talk about very briefly is simply the difficulties in testing something as complex as ASD. There are several causes, like I said earlier, that are fairly well established for ASD, but there are potentially numerous systems interacting in numerous ways that cause ASD, making the establishment of causal links extremely difficult, not to mention your innumerable symptoms and the broad scope that ASD sort of goes over. The other issue is that with diagnosing ASD, you're working with children under 3 years old, and you're talking about developmental disorders that involve social interactions and things of that nature. It can be very difficult to see if a child is genuinely having issues with social interaction, or, you know, if they're just shy, as they say, things like that. Although the FDA and the CDC and all these people do their best to heavily and completely define what you have to have, the diagnostic criteria, in order to diagnose autism or ASD as a whole. All right? So, with that, I'm going to jump right in now, and we're going to start getting to the nitty-gritty with talking about the anti-vaccine literature, the published, peer-reviewed literature that has come out over the last 16 years. First and foremost, again, as I mentioned before, I will not be completely comprehensive with either pro or anti-vaccine cases. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be going over some of the major cited publications that people on both sides use. And that said, I'm going to start off with the anti-vaccine literature. And we're going to start off with the big daddy himself, Dr. Andrew Wakefield, 1998. Iliolymphoid nodular hyperplasia, nonspecific colitis, and pervasive developmental disorder in children. Don't worry, I won't be saying those words again. Now, one thing to note that's very, very important is that Andrew Wakefield was a gastroenterologist. He was not a developmental biologist. He was not a psychiatrist or a psychologist or anything like that. However, this actually rings a little bit of a bell for me, where Ivan Pavlov was actually a physiologist. So that particular thing is no big deal, but it's an interesting fact. So in this paper, the authors attempted to show a causal link between the MMR vaccine, gastrointestinal problems, and then followed by an autism diagnosis. They called this specifically autistic colitis. Now, for those of you who don't know, colitis is essentially just issues with your colon. Again, he was a gastroenterologist. That's the kind of things that he was looking for, but I'm not going to go really in-depth into the science that he did. I'm just going to hit some of the high points. Now, when I say high points, what I actually mean for this particular paper is several of the major issues that exist within it. First and foremost, there is no control group for the vast majority of the data. For example, only one single test out of the entire paper was actually controlled for, and there was no, for example, like MMR vaccinated children who didn't have colon problems. There weren't unvaccinated children who had colon problems but no autism. Nothing like that. All this was a dozen children who had an MMR vaccine or some kind of exposure to measles, in the case of one, and then they had colitis, they had some kind of gastrointestinal problem, and excuse me, they had some kind of behavioral diagnostic, not diagnostic, but some kind of behavioral diagnosis. So, one of the biggest issues with this, one of the biggest issues with this paper was that the causation chain is actually somewhat unclear. Because parents of some of the children were quoted as saying that they didn't know when the gastrointestinal issues began. So you cannot establish a timeline to try to show that this autistic colitis is beginning and that this autistic colitis is actually occurring and affecting these children's neurodevelopment. The behavioral issues actually certainly started before some of the gastrointestinal issues in a couple of the cases as well, which goes completely against the hypothesis, which in this case was you have a vaccine, you have gastrointestinal issues, and then you get autism. That did not happen in several of the cases. Finally, or not finally, but, the time between the MMR vaccine, or what ended up being a measles infection in one of the cases, and the behavioral issues, the onset of the behavioral issues, varied massively in all of the cases. It went anywhere from 24 hours after receiving an MMR vaccine up to 2 months. And this is across all different ages. That is an exceedingly poorly controlled experiment. You cannot do that. You can't say that there is a causal link when one child is behaving differently only 24 hours after getting the vaccine. Not even after getting the gastrointestinal issues, but the vaccine. And then 24 hours later, they're behaving as though they're autistic. Versus 2 months later. You can't say that. It doesn't make scientific sense. And you can't test for that. You can't say that it's for sure. Incidentally, after 16 years, well now it's 16 years, but after 12 years, this was published in 1998 in The Lancet, which incidentally is an extremely prestigious journal in the UK. It was retracted completely in 2010. As part of this retraction, there were several issues that were found by essentially an ethics board that were seeing if Andrew Wakefield could essentially continue to practice medicine in the UK. First, they found that Andrew Wakefield accepted money to conduct this study in order to help move a litigation forward. In other words, there was a group of parents who were represented by a law firm, and they were suing the makers of this MMR vaccine, and these people paid Andrew Wakefield to do this study. That is a clear conflict of interest. On top of that, some of these patients were directed to Wakefield by the lawyers. Not by doctors, not by a normal referral method, but by the lawyers representing these parents. And they said, go see Dr. Wakefield, he's doing a study on this to establish this cause. You cannot do that. That is not only a clear conflict of interest, but it is a massive bias where it is science trying to prove a single thing. When they're not just testing the hypothesis, they're trying to show specifically that they are absolutely correct, and they won't even think that they are wrong. That is not how we do science. It does not work like that. It is completely wrong. On top of that, Andrew Wakefield performed unnecessary, painful procedures on autistic children, including spinal taps. An exceedingly painful procedure without the consent of the ethics board. Now what happened with this was that the ethics board actually approved his protocol. The problem is he did not perform the protocol as he wrote it. He did a whole bunch of other procedures and all sorts of other tests that he did not say he was going to do to the ethics board. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's completely insane. Next, one thing that he actually joked about during a presentation he was giving is that he actually purchased blood samples from his son's friends at a birthday party. He paid them £5. He was British, so he paid them £5 to get blood samples for a study that he was doing. It wasn't actually for this study, I don't think. It might have been, but either way, it wasn't really said too much about it. And incidentally, the review board and the editor of The Lancet both said that the facts, so-called, in this study were completely falsified. Nothing in it was true. But it still started a 16-year and ongoing revolution against vaccinations because of this. Because some guy got paid a bunch of money to lie. That's what it comes down to, and it's extremely unfortunate. Afterwards, After the retraction, he was also stripped of all of his rights and privileges as a doctor in the UK, and this effectively completely ended his career. Again, this happened back in 2010. Immediately after the publication, there was a lot of controversy, and people found out about the conflict of interest and all that kind of stuff. So he still bounced around a little bit, but he was still working on medical research, but now he has been completely stripped of his rights, and thankfully is not allowed to perform research anymore. Next up, we have a couple of publications by a woman named Laura Hewitson. Hewitson, I believe? I don't know exactly how to pronounce her name, I apologize. Anyway, she is actually a protege of Dr. Wakefield, and she continued some of his work using non-human primates. Specifically, she used rhesus macaque, or rhesus monkeys. And incidentally, she also has a very distinct conflict of interest. She has a child with autism and was actively litigating against an MMR vaccination maker during her experiments. Again, same kind of thing as Dr. Wakefield was doing, but just ridiculous. This doesn't make any sense. And on top of that, all of her papers, the papers I'm going to be talking about, stem from the same work pool that started with poster presentations back in 2008. And then there were 2 other papers that I'll be talking about briefly. So I will not be talking about the poster presentations because, first off, there's no peer review involved in that. It's essentially just, do you have data? Do you have something that you can put on a poster? Okay, great, you can go to this conference, whatever it happens to be. And secondly, with a poster presentation, you can pretty much say whatever you want. Again, since there's no peer review, it's not really controlled. There's poster presentations everywhere. Sometimes they're not even reviewed at all. It's just an automatic stamp of approval. So not going into those whatsoever. But 2 major papers were published out of this pool of work. First was delayed acquisition of neonatal reflexes in newborn primates receiving a thimerosal containing Hep B vaccine. Influence of gestational age and birth weight. Again, won't be saying that, no worries. This was published in Neurotoxicology back in 2009, and it, like Dr. Wakefield's paper, was actually withdrawn in 2010. Incidentally, Wakefield is actually one of the authors on this particular paper, so that's probably why they decided to retract it. They withdrew it. It wasn't actually done by the journal, it was done by the authors. They willingly said, we'll take it out. Part of the issue is, or one of the major issues with this, is they're trying to relate it to autism. This is one of the papers that a lot of anti-vaccine supporters cite and say, look, this is what's going on. But this is a very short-term study. This only took place over 14 days. And they were talking about these rhesus monkeys getting reflexes. So certainly that involves neurons, it involves neurodevelopment, but it involves motor neurons. It doesn't have anything to do with a lot of the aspects that autism touches, and that's really unfortunate. They don't have any sort of lasting neurological impact mentioning or testing, which again is the entire point of autism. It is a lifelong disorder. It doesn't just go away at some point, although if you believe Jenny McCarthy it does. In addition, something that's kind of funny is that the thimerosal had to be added to the vaccines because, again, they were trying to recapitulate the 1990s regimen, which still included thimerosal as a preservative. And it's funny because there's a quote from the paper that says that it was unknown if it was the vaccine, the thimerosal, or the combination of both that caused the issues for the monkeys. Incidentally, the conflict of interest that she had with her child was actually stated in this paper. And it also said that she had no involvement with data collection and or analysis. But the question then becomes, how is it that she is the first author? In the science world, if you are the first author on the paper, that means that you do the lion's share of the work. It was your idea, you did the legwork, you did the analysis, you wrote up the paper, all of that kind of stuff. It all falls on you, and you did the vast majority. Being a later author probably means something like you provided a specific cell type, an animal model, you provided a plasmid, something like that. You still had a contribution, and it was still an important contribution, but I don't understand. She was still first author somehow. It doesn't make any sense. But again, that was withdrawn as well. but still, glaring scientific errors regardless of its withdrawal. Second, the paper that is actually still out in the world is Influence of Pediatric Vaccines on Amygdala Growth and Opioid Binding in Rhesus Macaque Infants, a Pilot Study. So I mentioned earlier that the amygdala is one of the portions of the brain that is affected by autism. And in this case, the amygdala is actually what's commonly called the fear center. It's a lot about fight or flight and things like that. So in this particular paper, this was published in Acta Neurobiologicae Experimentalis in 2010, and to me, this is just an example of bad science really getting worse. What they were trying to do again is just show some kind of correlation, not causation, between receiving these vaccines and subsequently having autism-like symptoms. But especially with rhesus macaque, it's really difficult to show things like social disorders and things of that nature, or it's harder compared with children. But regardless, it's kind of funny. First off, there is no acknowledgement of her conflict of interest, and there is no authorship by Wakefield. He is in an acknowledgement, like it just says thank you very much to Dr. Andrew Wakefield, but he is not an author on the paper. Now, incidentally, for this particular paper, a total of 16 rhesus monkeys were used, 4 control and 12 exposed. If those numbers seem a bit weird, listen to this quote. We purposely assigned a larger number of animals to the exposed group in order to optimize the chances of observing what we anticipated to be an uncommon or idiosyncratic effect. They knew that they weren't going to see it. So they were like, we'll just have a bunch more in this group and it'll make total sense. In addition, you only have four in the control group. 4 monkeys that only received a saline injection. That is not nearly enough. You cannot base these massive sweeping claims on such a small sample size. You just cannot do it. It is bad science. It's bad methodology. So one of the other issues that I personally had with this was that the monkeys actually received an accelerated schedule of the vaccines, in part because they mature more quickly than children. But again, part of the problem is that they added the thimerosal. So these monkeys got in a year what most human children will get in 4 years. It's just ridiculous. We're talking about weeks instead of months between the vaccines, and the monkeys mature faster. But remember, I mentioned the half-life of thimerosal is 7 to 10 days. So even if you're talking about, weeks versus months, you're still going to have an accumulation of the ethyl mercury in the rhesus monkeys. Again, probably not enough to cause toxic levels, but the half-life is still the half-life. They are not going to metabolize it faster. They're still getting the same amount per kilogram as children normally do. It doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. Next, a lot of the evidence in this particular paper was with imaging by PET and MRI. PET is the positron emission topography and MRI is magnetic resonance imaging. I'm not going to go over exactly how they work. It's kind of irrelevant for this part. Now, the imaging data they have for this paper is based off of 9 exposed and 2 unexposed animals. If those numbers seem strange, it might be because we are missing 5. Originally, there were 4 control and 12 exposed, but now we're missing 3 exposed and we're missing 2 of the controls. If 4 control was bad, 2 is even worse. In any scientific publication, you will see the minimum number of replicates that you want is 3. At minimum. And these guys are getting away with 2 in the control. This is completely backwards. It doesn't make any sense. This is absolutely terrible science. And on top of that, what they discovered was that the amygdala actually shrank in the unexposed control animals, while it grew at a normal rate in the vaccinated ones. Normal. So It just doesn't make any sense. They're trying to pass this off as, well, remember, in autistic children, you have an outgrowth, you have an increased growth in the brain, and then it normalizes afterwards. But that's not what's going on. The amygdala was growing at an ordinary rate for a rhesus macaque monkey. It was growing ordinarily in the vaccinated ones. It was growing abnormally in the controls. That doesn't make any sense. You can't associate those two. And then, on top of that, again, so few control animals is a terrible, terrible thing to have. And one thing I haven't mentioned is the opioid linkage. Remember, that was part of the original statement of the article. One of the things is that they essentially did this because the amygdala binds opioids and it can affect behavior during development. However, they didn't find any significant changes in binding, and the thing is that these are actually associated with various injuries as well as different toxicities to the brain. Not simply autism, not simply neurodevelopmental disorders. It's really somewhat out of place. But again, no significant changes pretty much across the board. So it was really irrelevant for this part. Last but not least, on the anti-vaccination side of the peer-published data is, I do apologize, I'm probably going to butcher this name, is a paper by Helen Ratazniak. I do apologize, I'm not certain how to pronounce her name, but the paper itself is titled Theoretical Aspects of Autism, Causes, a Review. So a review paper is simply looking at a whole lot of different literature sources and just seeing what the general consensus is. So you can talk about different categories. We see a lot of that stuff in my field, the stem cell field, and it's just a good way to get a lot of information very quickly so you don't have to go to a whole bunch of different papers. This particular one was published in 2011 in the Journal of Immunotoxicology, and this examined several known, well-established causes as well as some lesser-known, not quite as established, but potential causes of autism, including vaccinations and particularly MMR. She also did discuss thimerosal, but she actually stated it as being both a potential cause of autism and not a potential cause of autism. Quote from the paper here, thimerosal has been implicated as a cause for autism. Not only is every major symptom of autism documented in cases of mercury poisoning, but also biological abnormalities in autism are very similar to the side effects of mercury poisoning itself. Later on in the paper, quote, a review of 10 epidemiologic studies concluded that the data do not unequivocally demonstrate a link between thimerosal-containing vaccines and autism. So what I see this saying is simply that if you get mercury poisoning, then you will have symptoms similar to autism. But I really don't want to say that she's trying to imply that all autistic children are essentially suffering from mercury poisoning, because that's what it sounds like from the first quote. It's like, yes, they are similar, but that's it. They're similar. It's just like saying the flu is really similar to a cold, but it's worse. You know, they're similar, but they're not the same. So I'm not really certain what she was trying to do with that. Incidentally, as far as the MMR vaccine, she cited a whole bunch of papers that say, look, this isn't happening. All these papers say that there's no link, no link, no link. But she mentions at the very end, residual DNA in the vaccine is stated as a potential cause, because DNA can potentially cause post-birth what's it called? Encephalitis, swelling of the brain. But no. Not only is the amount of DNA in vaccines, yes, there is DNA in vaccines, not only is it minute at best, but by itself, it will do nothing. Not only can DNA not cross the blood-brain barrier, but even if it could, it can't get into the cells, much less cause such massive effects as to cause autism, an entirely unique and massive behavioral neurodevelopmental disorder. Even if it was possible, DNA by itself cannot do it, especially in the vastly minute amounts that it is found in these vaccines. So, That's it for that particular review. Again, she did go over a lot of things like the genetic aspects and all that, but that was just saying that yes, these exist. I already mentioned those, as well as the other prenatal ones too. So I'm not going to go back into those. Now, with those papers, those are some of the major publications regarding anti-vaccination and quote, establishing the link between autism and specifically the MMR vaccine, but also why they are fundamentally bad science and in the end, essentially wrong. So with that, I'm going to move right along ahead and start to talk about the evidence that is against the link between vaccines and autism. Starting straight off with all of the evidence that goes against vaccines causing autism, I have to say that there are literally dozens and dozens of studies that refute this particular link, not only spread across numerous countries, but also spread across numerous ages of children, different types of studies, different ages of the children, all sorts of different things tested, but nothing finds a link. And as such, I really can't pick just going over 2 or 3, so what I'm gonna do is look at what we call combinatorial or meta-analysis based ones. And what these studies do is these will take all sorts of other studies, combine all the data together, and then see if there are any trends in these massive pools of data rather than looking at studies individually. So first is a relatively recent paper by Taylor et al. It came out this year, 2014, and it was in the journal Vaccine. And the title was very apt, saying, "Vaccines are not associated with autism, an evidence-based meta-analysis of case control and cohort studies." So this was a meta-analysis of a total of 10 studies from around the world, and the countries were Denmark, the USA, Poland, Japan, and the UK. All told, from all of these 10 studies, there was a total of over 1.2 million children that were being tested for any sort of link between autism and the MMR vaccine. So this includes correct controls of having patients who were given the MMR vaccine and did not have autism, patients who were given MMR and did have autism, controlling for ages, all of that kind of stuff. Again, 1.2 million, it's a big pool to draw from. Again, for this particular paper, no link was found between thimerosal, mercury, general vaccinations, or MMR specifically to autism. Nothing at all. Nothing was there. Next up is the Gerber and Offit paper from 2009 in Clinical Infectious Diseases. This paper was called Vaccines and Autism, A Tale of Shifting Hypotheses. And this was actually an interesting paper because what the authors did is they essentially took this data after Wakefield. Again, this is about 10 years after Wakefield's paper. And they said, all right, well, here's the original thing that said this, right? Then we have all of these other studies that refute that evidence. So here's a new hypothesis. Here's all of the studies that refute that hypothesis, and then we move on and go like that. It's a very interesting paper, and it's actually free, so you guys can take a look at that. But like I said, it goes through 3 major arguments in this case. The first is MMR, the vaccine itself. Second is thimerosal. And the third is having multiple simultaneous vaccines, or what has been called overwhelming the child's immune system and causing autism in this case. So for each, the authors cite numerous studies that do not support the link, and they briefly discuss the exact numbers from each of the studies, as well as discussing the methodologies that each study used. So first, there were 13 studies that were cited that rebutted the MMR one, including looking specifically at the gastrointestinal problems. Because if you remember, the autistic colitis was the initial thing that Dr. Wakefield was trying to discuss. And these ones specifically refuted the gastrointestinal aspect as well. There were 7 studies that refuted the thimerosal link, and also that's been really well established now, especially since it's no longer in vaccines, and also it wasn't in the MMR vaccine since '83 again. The overwhelming the immune system is actually interesting because it was based on a single case that the CDC said don't worry about this, it's a single case and it doesn't make sense. But people still freaked out about it, and so the authors felt the need to address it to a certain extent. And for this, there aren't really any studies for it because there's no real good way to study this. You can't really have proper controls for something about this kind of thing where you say, are you overwhelming a child's immune system? How can you even tell? So it makes it very difficult. So what they did is they set a couple of bullet points. First, immunizations today are actually less immunogenic than they were in the past, even though we are being given more vaccinations. Part of the reason for that is because we have made more efficient vaccinations. We don't need them to be as immunogenic, and we found out that it's not necessary to have a heavily immunogenic response. Second, the immune systems are not weakened by vaccines, and that was actually found by a couple of studies that tested unvaccinated and vaccinated children against various insults, so things like colds and other types of infections. And both the vaccinated and unvaccinated children reacted in the same manner. Right? There is some evidence relating unusual immune features to autism that I mentioned before, but again, it is not shown to be a cause. Autism is not an autoimmune disorder like something along the lines of MS. In MS, your cells actively destroy sheathing around your neurons, so you start to have a lot of problems with motion and movement. Autism, that doesn't happen. We do not have an autoimmune effect. Right? Next up is a paper by Demicelli back in 2012. This paper is absolutely epic. It is incredible. The title of this paper is Vaccines for Measles, Mumps, and Rubella in Children. This paper is nearly 200 pages that goes on everything you could possibly want to know about not only the combination MMR vaccine, but also the individual mumps, measles, rubella vaccines as well. It combined the data from a total of 74 studies looking at a total of over 14.7 million children. 14.7 million. And again, this is across, it has to be across all continents, all over the place, a whole bunch of different studies, whole bunch of different types of studies, means of doing the studies, all sorts of appropriate controls, everything. 74 studies, 74. Absolutely ridiculous. And amongst many, 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 many other findings, there was no link to autism. And any of these vaccines, be it the MMR combination or the individual mumps, measles, and rubella vaccines by themselves. No link to not only autism, but many other things, including stuff like Crohn's disease, I know was one of them. That's a gastrointestinal problem as well. So just all sorts of things. Pretty much anything you could possibly want to know about the side effects of MMR vaccines is in that paper. So I advise you to look at it. It's pretty interesting. All right. So with that, that summarizes all of the publications that I wanted to talk about regarding there not being a link between the MMR vaccine and autism. But keep in mind, I may have only talked about 3 publications, but all told, they themselves talk about around 80 unique individual studies. And amongst all of those, there is no link. So, with that, I'm going to move right into the long-term implications of Andrew Wakefield's research, as well as some more stuff about autism itself and the legacy that Wakefield has left behind. First and foremost, when talking about the legacy of Andrew Wakefield and his work, immediately after this publication, or rather after a press conference that he gave, vaccine usage dropped substantially in many parts of the world, primarily in the UK and the US, and it dropped by basically double digits. We're talking about 20-25% fewer people receiving vaccines. And as part of this, one of the issues is that we've got these diseases that are still around, but because of vaccines, they were under control. Measles, for example, had been declared eliminated. It's eliminated in the US, which means that there is no continuous transmission for 12 or more months. And that happened back in 2000, so literally 2 years after this publication happened. But we still have outbreaks. There are still outbreaks every year to different extents, but most of which are related to groups of people who are not vaccinated, and they come into contact with people from other countries who essentially bring measles to the US. That said, in 2014, there have been over 600 cases of measles in the US amongst 20 outbreaks thus far. Obviously, 2014 is pretty much over, so those are probably pretty solid numbers. From January to April alone, there were 58 cases reported in just California, which is the highest number of measles cases since 1995. Way back in the day. Now, obviously, that's not really correlated with anything, since in 1998, when the study was published, you would expect that that kind of spike would have happened a little bit later on. But then also think about this, where immediately afterwards, if we're talking about kids who are either born relatively close or just after that paper was published, that's really when the hysteria started to pick up. So, who knows? Either way, lots and lots of cases, very inappropriate because we should be vaccinating. In the UK and Finland, they also had massive outbreaks where a UK outbreak in 2012 had 15,000 cases, and a 2011 case in Finland had 2,000 cases. Massive outbreaks on a disease that we should not have to deal with because it's vaccinated. It's fine. And as part of this, as sort of an offshoot, it's not MMR, but whooping cough or pertussis had a massive outbreak in California back in 2012. There were approximately 50,000 cases with 20 deaths in 2012, compared to only about 3,000 cases per year in the 1980s. The pertussis vaccine was developed in the 1960s, and cases dropped from several 100,000 a year all the way down to about 6,000 in a decade. And then it just went down and down until Wakefield's paper, where now we had an outbreak of 50,000 in 1 year. It's insane. We're almost back to when before the vaccine was available. It's just ludicrous. It doesn't make any sense. I don't understand. Either way, unfortunately, vaccinations, even today, are still relatively low, obviously, in the wake of all of this and continuing on with hysteria. But thankfully, they are gradually starting to increase back. That said, one of the major issues is that we do see the epidemiology of autism increasing. We see more autism in our children today. So why is that? If it's not vaccines, if it's not thimerosal, then what is it? Well, the first thing that I want to mention with that is that an increase in diagnoses does not necessarily mean an increase in the actual prevalence. Just because it's being diagnosed more doesn't mean it's actually in the population more. For one thing, there's better education for parents. Especially with all of this controversy going on, people are more watchful for autism signs in their children. And not only that, but there's an increased efficacy by practitioners. There's more stable, more concrete definitions for what autism is. So we have more diagnoses. But that said, the definition may be more concrete, but it itself is broader. There are a lot more things that can be classified as autism. Remember, I mentioned ASD, autism spectrum disorder. ASD, anything that falls under ASD can be considered autism for the purposes of saying this child is autistic. They have autism spectrum disorder. A lot of times people refer to Asperger's syndrome as mild autism. But it's not necessarily the case. It is technically a separate thing. But it is bunched in with ASD. The other thing is that there are also diagnoses at younger and younger ages. Again, this goes back to being more watchful by not only parents but teachers as well. Kids, even in like nursery school, preschool, are being diagnosed with autism because people are more vigilant and watching out for the signs and the symptoms. And because of that, obviously, we have an increase in diagnosis. Again, that doesn't mean the actual prevalence. It doesn't mean that there actually is more autism. It just means that we are diagnosing it more. Now, that said, it could also be that there actually is an increase in the instance, but other potential causes need to be researched. We need to get off this vaccine thing. It's fairly clear that that is not what's going on. Studies after studies after studies after studies upon studies say that there is no link. The whole thing was discredited and thrown out. It's not there. We need to go and do something else. Very, very important. Now, so with that, there's amongst many other things in the long-term implications, we've got diseases coming back that shouldn't be coming back. We've got parents who are still scared. We've got younger and younger diagnoses. We've got all sorts of things that can not only explain why there is more autism, but also we need to be sure that we look at these diseases and make sure that we try to get rid of them. So with that, I'll just jump right ahead and talk very briefly about some conclusions. So after all of that, after 16 years, millions of dollars in research funding, there is no credible evidence to support any link whatsoever between vaccines and autism. Not just the MMR vaccine, but any vaccine at all. And again, 16 years, millions of dollars. What we need to do is we need to be spending that money on other, potentially more valuable work that we actually need to have. We need to see, what about other causes for autism? How about looking more into actual neurodevelopment and seeing what other things can affect it? Not talking about vaccines anymore. What about better treatment options for children and adults that have autism, that are autistic? What about trying to better integrate them into society? What about trying to give them better treatment plans and get them with people who can help them and maybe make them a little bit more sociable, things of that nature? What about better and more effective vaccines for more diseases? You may be familiar with this guy. His name is Ebola. We need vaccines for other diseases. And on top of that, I mean, autism is a very, very important disease. And one thing that I really want to say, that I want to drive home, is that I have all the sympathy in the world for not only the parents who are affected by autism, but autistic people themselves too. It is a terrible, it is a horrible, unpleasant, awful disease. But the problem is that we need to look at what is actually going on. We cannot have this pseudoscience crap. We can't look at this and latch onto it and continue on with it. We are wasting time. We are wasting money. And I know that parents and children just want answers. It is so frustrating. But the problem is science has not caught up with it yet. It's sad. It is terrible. It is terribly unfortunate that science is far behind on this. But we are trying. We are working day and night to find these things, to find these actual causes, to find things that are really problems, and to try to fix them. But please, stop. I beg you, stop believing this stuff. It's not true. It was thrown out by the people who published it. Study after study says that it's wrong. Everything refutes it. Please, we as a society, we need to move on. We need to move into the future. And we need to have the realization and the understanding that in the end, vaccines do their job. They protect us. They protect our children. They protect other children who can't be vaccinated. They protect all of us from these devastating, potentially deadly diseases. And we need to understand that they work and they are safe. all of the research, all of the data that is credible says these are fine, they are safe, they work. Please give them to your kids. Please. Please. So, with that, I know it was another long one, but thank you very, very much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it. Again, please feel free to put your comments down below. And again, if you are going to be putting comments along the lines of saying that I am wrong, trying to refute things that I'm saying here, please cite something. Give a link, give a reference, give something that I can click on, something I can look up so that I can see what you're talking about. Because I want to have a discussion. I don't want it to be one-sided. This is clearly still a discussion. So please, start it. Have at it. Say what you want. But just make sure you say where you get your information. So with that, thank you very much again. Please feel free to look at the links in the description below. I put in pretty much every single paper that I talked about, as well as some links to general information as well. So thank you very much again for watching, and I will see you next time. Thank you again for watching my video on the now defunct link between vaccinations and autism. While I know that many of you probably do not agree with everything that I said, all that I ask is that you do your research. Most importantly, whatever research that you do, make certain that the information is from credible, cited, peer-reviewed resources, because that means that it's at least more likely to be true, regardless of what the situation is in any scientific field. With that, thank you again, and if you would like to see some more of my videos, you can see a few of them linked up at the top of the page, and if you want to see more in the future, go ahead and click on the big giant subscribe button right in the middle. Thank you very much again, and I will see you next time.